Rightio, councillors, we're all here. Are we streaming, Matt? Excellent. So welcome everybody. We've just been discussing all of the money we got from the federal government in the federal budget. Well, we've finished that discussion and we'll move on to the general business. So I'm not aware of, we're all here, I'm not aware of any conflicts of interest. If I could have somebody confirm the minutes. Move Councillor Barton-Lumsden, seconded Councillor Taylor. All in favour? Carried. We've got several starred items. Does anybody wish to unstar any items? Councillors, 6.1 is the making of the regulated parking amendment. Does anybody need to discuss any of that, or are you happy for that to be starred as well? Yep, so we'll star 6.1 as well. So if somebody would like to move 5.1, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4 and 6.7, move Councillor Pauline Young, seconded Councillor Darren Taylor. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. That should clear the room. Yeah, come on. I want more than 3 people to leave, or we'll. 1, 2. Yep. Alison says she's going. 3. Kath has to stay. Yeah, everybody else can stay. Okay, so that gets us to 6.5, acceptable requests, policy and guidelines. Julie?
Oh,
who wants to have
I'll have a crack at it.
Excellent. Joe wants to have it. So, Joe, you've had lots of practice. I think this is the fourth time.
Chairman, hopefully the fourth and last, but so there's been some discussion at the previous meeting where this was considered. If you go to page 154 and 155, it effectively sets out some of the changes to or the proposed changes
154 and 155.
155. Some of the proposed changes.
Can we let Joe have a stab and then we'll come to questions?
So I think one of the key issues that was raised at the last meeting was, can we sort of align this to the customer request system? And we've had a look at that, and I guess at the moment the answer is no, but we'll look at the customer experience platform to align with this and incorporate effectively these sorts of requests. So as I said, at the moment we can't do it, but I think into the future, in the next couple of years, we will be able to. So we've just looked at some of those issues. I won't go through them, but hopefully we've made all the changes now that respond to the questions.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Councillor Gates.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 155, with regard to the tracking of requests, it says that a spreadsheet of requests will be created for each division. Do you mean in each division? Like, does it mean that our PAs will create a spreadsheet and they'll keep it up to date?
We'll do that. We'll do it, and then obviously you'll have access to it in terms of status of the particular request.
So you'll have to have staff monitoring every request issued from every office?
There was just a request in terms of a better tracking system. So what we've come up with is that for each division, we'll create a spreadsheet. So if the councillors don't want to track it, that's fine. But the option's available.
I just thought it would be easier for councillors' officers to manage that and keep you copied, because then it's...
So Councillor Gates, I think that it was the administration's attempt to accommodate the particular request of Councillor Vorster in regards to the tracking of his requests. So, and the spreadsheet...
Well, maybe he wouldn't issue as many if he had to keep track of it himself.
Well, I suppose this is the fourth time here and we're trying to get it across the line, you know?
Well, Councillor Vorster's not here today, so...
Well, I think he's...
I mean, my understanding is we need to keep track of it anyway, so the way we'll actually track it is we'll set it up by division, and if the councillors or the councillors' PA or support staff want to go into it and check it, they can, but if they don't...
Well, we already keep one.
So
I mean, I'm sure most officers have a system.
The register of the CRs
Yeah.
raised.
Yours has a spreadsheet.
But Julie might be able to explain it better.
Julie.
Through you, Mr Chair. With the
Excuse me, I'm
spreadsheets, we
sorry.
did an audit for the February council requests, and things that fall under this policy in particular, which is just requests for advice and information, there was only 14 across all divisions. So the spreadsheets aren't that onerous in terms of
Julie, can I
updating
ask,
them.
the 14 across the divisions, was there a particular division that featured in that list?
Councillor Vorster was already trialling this new system, so his spreadsheet was up and active at that time. So this is all the remaining councillors over February which were entering them through the usual pathway system, those ones which would normally come out of pathway and be put through as a request for information or advice, and there was only 14. So you're literally looking at some councils' offices would have like 3 or 4 a month that would just fall into this type of request, just the policy for information or advice.
Which really doesn't surprise me, because I think that the earlier confusion was around the difference between a request for information and a request for service. And service is business as usual and should just carry on and not be recorded. That's correct. So I'll pause there to go to Councillor Tozer.
So my question is just about the acceptable request, the process for it. There's been occasions where I've become aware of one of our colleagues. Normally we use the acceptable request guidelines to gather information about making a decision. That's normally what happens. It's not always the case, but most of the time we're involved in decision making. We either will send a CR, we don't get what we want, and so we leverage the acceptable request guidelines to get further information that apparently is beyond the normal processes. And I'm assuming that's what we're talking about today. The acceptable request guidelines, there's 14 times where we have to ask for something a bit... Yeah. So I actually think a log is helpful, because there's been times where I have become aware of one of my colleagues making a request under the acceptable request guidelines, and there was some sort of practice some time ago where when someone leveraged that mechanism, the answer was provided to all councillors. And my understanding is that practice somewhere along the line changed, where under the acceptable request guidelines.
I think the policy talks about that being at the discretion of the CEO.
And I get that, but I think it would be a valuable resource for councillors to at least be aware in some collaborative fashion when that mechanism is being used. So if that information is informative for one councillor to make a decision, it really should be available to all councillors to help them make a decision.
So,
Just taking what Councillor Owen Jones said, if the CEO or the office thinks that it impacts another division or another councillor, we'll provide that information. Not all the time, but we will provide it. So it's using our sort of discretion in terms of whether we think it should be communicated to all councillors.
So the point I'm trying to get at is I'm not sure the CEO necessarily should be making that call, because I'm actually interested in Mudgeeraba. Every single road goes through Robina. So if Councillor Vorster asks a question under the acceptable request guidelines that relates to Robina roads, he might not think, and the CEO might not think it has anything to do with Division 9, but my view might be that that's actually important to me, and I don't want to automatically get the response, but having some sort of common resource where I might be able to once a month check the acceptable request guidelines. Oh, well, that information that was provided to Councillor Vorster might be interesting to me. I think that would be good. Obviously, the CEO or whatever delegated authority has the opportunity to refuse that information under whatever policy, but the idea that we can all share access to the information about acceptable requests being made, I think actually has merit, and I don't think it currently exists. Am I right?
Julie, the other divisional councillors get access to each division's list. I'm assuming that's the case.
that will be the future. I think Councillor Tozer has just talked about it not existing at the moment.
Right.
But the intent of this policy is that there will now be a register of those 170 items that are requests for information, and you will be able to do what you're suggesting, and that's you'll be able to inspect at an irregular basis at your own leisure as to what have been raised. But I think what Julie's suggesting also is for the month of February, there are 14 of them. So, and like I think, so whilst the CEO or his delegate may not always get it right in regards to the distribution of that information, I think that they've got a pretty good handle also on what is something that might be a request that has got a impact across more than one division, and something that is quite tight, you know, so.
I get that.
And I hear what you're saying about if Councillor Vorster's put one in about Robina Roads, you might want to know about it.
And he might not think that. I mean, we talk pretty regularly, so he probably would know that. But yeah, the example I think I would use is the lobbyist register. So when I log into the lobbyist register and I put information about having met a lobbyist, either inadvertently or intentionally, or for whatever reason I might meet a lobbyist, I can see everyone who's entered information on that register. And at that time, I can kind of review what decision-making information is being provided to all of my colleagues. It occurs to me that this system should operate relatively similarly to that. Is that intended?
You'll have access to, I mean, it's not confidential, the actual request. I mean, some of the information provided may end up being confidential, but
And I get that. I don't want the
Yeah.
information on that list.
You're talking
Just
about the register.
that an acceptable request is not confidential in and of itself. That's what I'm kind of seeking confirmation of. Great. Awesome.
And I suppose we're trying to land in a place where that information is able to be shared, so that there isn't an advantage per se to somebody holding more information than somebody else, you know. So, but it's a balance between keeping the register up to date, and also it's beholden on us as councillors to not send in 100 requests for information and expect to get 100 answers, because there will be a point where the CEO says that's just business as usual, the questions that are being asked. Councillor Gates, did you have a question?
Well, I was just going to say that the Office of the Mayor is often informed of those sort of requests, and just last week, exactly as Councillor Tozer has described, I became aware of a report that was issued to 2 councillors, and I immediately asked that it be distributed to all councillors, and it was. So
That's
it's
awesome.
precisely the point that is being raised, and the information that had been requested was to inform our discussions on the corporate plan.
Wow.
So I felt that it was important that everyone received it, and we did.
So to me, the idea that Councillor Gates had to, request for that to occur, it really should be a matter of policy. It shouldn't be a matter for the acting mayor to have to take that step.
Which
we
is
normally
what
do
today is effectively about, because
Great.
we create a register of those types of requests. But I also think we have to, so whilst the register will do one thing, I think we have to rely on the skill of the officers also to be able to identify when material is actually, there's a sensitivity there where it makes sense to share it across a broader group of councillors than just the one person asking for the information. So, and I'll give you an example. Recently I had a briefing about something, it was the information briefing where it was suggested that the city had doubled the number of transactions in regards to property settlements.
Yes.
And so I asked for what does that mean in regards to stamp duty? Can we get that? And so a table has been prepared and has been provided to me, but that might be something that through this mechanism might be of a lot of interest to a lot of other people. I wanted to know, because on very broad numbers, the state of Queensland's collected twice as much stamp duty from the Gold Coast in the last 12 months than it has in the previous 12 months. So if I was interested in knowing if they picked up $300 or $400 million extra because of the rising market, that might give them an opportunity to invest $300 or $400 million in the city that's contributed it. So that to me is where information is important. That's not confidential information because it's effectively comes from public records, but the disbursement of it is what today's about.
There's plenty of examples like that. There's one not that long ago where you asked a question under an acceptable request guideline about an information that was specifically pertaining to Division 2, and whilst that information itself wasn't important to me, the mechanism by which that activity occurred revealed something else about the organisation that we needed to take action on, and we did, and that is important. It's important for us to do that. It is actually our obligation as councillors.
Councillor Pauling.
And thanks through the chair. I think, and what you just spoke about then too, is I think if it's left up to one person's discretion, they might think, well, it's not information that we'd like to share. But because we all have different strengths, and that's why we're all in this room together, like for you to ask that question, I'm very interested in that, because if the state government's got $300 or $400 extra million, why aren't we getting a brass razoo? That's information that collectively I don't necessarily sit there and think about, but very interested in decisions that we voting on going forward. So I think whilst it's good to say here's one person who's going to decide whether we need to know or not to know, maybe we need to be able to make that call too, because that type of information is what you've spoken about, and what the deputy mayor or the acting mayor's spoken about is the same thing.
So can I ask a question about if we as a councillor ask a question that's actually too resource intensive to come up with an answer, what is the practical relation? What's the practical answer? So I raise a request formally I would like a list of every approval in the city over the last 6 years that was for a building that had more than up to 50% height increase as part of that process. So, but I know, because I've asked Alicia if that's possible, and she's informed me that it's actually very labour intensive to come up with that. How does this policy deal with the harsh reality of how it impacts on resourcing to answer a question?
Through you, Mr Chair, there's a number of escalation points. So some of the starting points would probably be to find out what you need the information for. Can we revise the scope of the request? Can we just give you, are you only needing a certain part of that? Can we extend the time frame? And if it's something that you think you definitely need or it would benefit the council to have that information, we can decline it under this request, then negotiate an extended time frame so it doesn't need the 20 days response time.
Or alternatively, if it's declined under this policy, maybe the only solution then is for it to actually be elevated to a general business item at council, which then calls for a report, which resolves the timeline but doesn't absolve the administration from having to provide the information over time. So, and the reason why I asked Alicia that was at the last council meeting I had asked her to confirm that no properties had been approved with a height limit of more than the 50%, which she did, and that kind of the lead-up question to that is what control has that 50% had in the context of all of the other approvals? And the answer is a lot. It's just expensive to come up with. Are there any other questions, councillors? Councillor Hamill, did you have a question?
Not a question, Mr Chair, but just that example that you gave then was exactly what, when Joe was acting CEO, we went through with my question put to him on staffing, resourcing. I think we had 2 timeline delays because I accepted it was labour intensive, and that worked fine, but that offer was made to me at that stage was if I wanted to escalate it, it could go back through GBI, but because I put it on notice through this committee, I was happy with that. But I think I specified with that question that the answers be provided to all councillors, which it was.
Yeah, and this policy means that whilst that request is admirable, it's the officer's decision to do that.
And we would have done it.
Yeah.
Sorry, what you just said is that the officers decide, or is it a matter of policy that information is shared at least about the acceptable request?
No, we'll decide if we think that it's appropriate to give to all councillors or other councillors.
But
if we get it wrong, I mean, the councillor.
So Glenn, it'll be on a register, right?
Great.
So if I write to the officer under 170 and say, I'd like to know the number of registered dogs on Hope Island,
yes,
and they reply back to me, well, I write to them and say, I'd like to know the number of registered dogs on Hope Island, and I'd like you to advise all other councillors what that number is, right? And you're all going to roll your eyes because you're not interested in the 1,500 dogs on Hope Island.
Correct.
But the officers shouldn't be directed to distribute that information. It'll be on a register if you want to go looking for it.
So, so they make the decision about the provision of the information, but the register logs all the requests,
Yeah,
and that
right.
is publicly accessible. Any councillor can access that.
Yep.
There isn't a delegation about whether it goes on the register or not.
So the answers themselves, so everything will go on the register. The answers themselves may be confidential and not be publicly available, but the public will know that there's been a request made. And I'm assuming that the public could then pursue an RTI request based on the kind of skeleton information that they have on that register.
But if a councillor does become aware of a question that the officers have said, well, it's probably not for everyone, we can request information from that register and that'll go through a proper process. That's great. Thank you.
Is Councillor McDonald?
Just a question through you to Mr McCabe. Is there any information that councillors will be denied access to within council?
I mean, we'll make that decision at the time, but unless it's something that we believe that councillors don't need to effectively do their job, but Julie can refer to the policy on that.
Through you, Mr Chair, there are some pieces of information that have been listed in the policy that are excluded, such as like CCC investigations and stuff like that. So it's just all that legal privilege type matters, but generally most stuff is available to councillors. Yeah, it's in the Act, what's not available.
And what's the recourse for a councillor that's had information denied? What can they do? So they can appeal to the CEO for a review?
That's correct, Mr Chair.
And if the CEO maintains the position or the decision, they can then, how would they then elevate it past the policy to satisfy themselves?
It could be raised with the Mayor, Mr Chair.
Yeah. Or alternatively, could it be raised as a general business item as a question on notice, for example? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but that is going to be, Councillor McDonald, I suppose it's important to flesh it out. I think that's going to be very much the outlier rather than the norm. So if you have requested information and it's been refused, that is very much a reason to explore that. But if it gets reviewed by the CEO and refused for a second time, there's probably a fundamental reason why as well.
I just wanted to make it, and I just wanted to have that discussion in the public arena.
Councillor Gates.
That we might be denied. Records of the Councillor Conduct Tribunal, records of a former conduct review body, information where the disclosure of that information would be contrary to an order of a court or tribunal, and information or advice that would be privileged from production in a legal proceeding on the ground of legal professional privilege, which is exactly as we've been advised.
Which are quite narrow, but also quite sensible in regards to context. Rightio. Would anybody like to move it?
I'll move it.
Moved by Councillor Gates, second by Councillor Pauline Young. Councillor Gates, would you like to speak to it, or would you like it to rest until full council?
Rest. 4 times is enough.
So would anybody like to speak for or against? Excellent. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Uh, 6.6, procurement policy contract manual review, sustainable procurement. Here's one that I missed starring. I'm happy to move it. Would anybody like to second it? Seconded Councillor Gates. Would anybody have any questions? All in favour? Carried. Sorry for not starring it earlier. That leaves us with the customer experience strategy, which I think we will move into close because it does deal with matters that impact on the local government budget. So I'm happy to move for it to go to closed. Seconded Councillor Pauline Young. All in favour? Carried. So if we can move tape, please? Thank you.
Yes.
Councillors, would we all like to vote to move to open? Doubly in open. Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I won't be supporting this resolution. I can't support that 115 over the next 12 years. And also, I would like to see the 3 monthly basis. I know that 6 months is a long time, and I know that 3 months is probably, you know, a short period of time. But if it's not going to come back for a council decision, I'd certainly like to see a shorter time frame with the reports.
Councillor McDonald, would you like to move an amendment?
Not at the present.
Okay. Would anybody like to speak for or against the Councillor Gates?
Thank you, Chairman. I think this has come for us on a couple of occasions previously, and I would like to say thank you to the officers today for the great presentation, which made it much more simple for me to understand. It's very clear what we are attempting to do here, and that is to provide a more efficient and effective database for information for all of our customers, and the ratepayers of this city are very important to us, and we obviously want to make their experience in dealing with council as pleasant as possible. And it's often in an environment where they have concerns, and I think the survey that has been undertaken and the information that it has provided are allowing us to focus very intently on what the customer needs are. And the new system that we are endorsing today will go a long way to improving the customer service experience. And that's what we're here for. We're here for the ratepayers of this city, so they should be our prime concern, and I think we're showing our commitment to them by endorsing the recommendation before us today.
Thank you. Councillor Hamill.
Mr Chairman, just very quickly to speak in support that I think the last time this came through committee, we rightly put it on hold to allow the new director and the new CEO to have their chance to review the strategy and have their input into the strategy. I was particularly comforted to hear their feedback on their thoughts on it, since it will be on them to run through this over the next decade to see it going forward. Always a lot of talk about using technology to improve customer service, but when the actual rubber hits the floor, it comes at a cost, and it's not a small cost. But kind of to back on what Councillor Gates says, I'm more comforted after this report and seeing more detail and seeing the extra rigour that went into the process that it's a worthwhile investment to make to improve customer service interaction with our ratepayers.
Would anybody else like to comment? So I'll close just by saying that clearly the City of Gold Coast has invested an enormous amount of money into customer contact, at least over the last 10 years, and this ultimately is a strategy that propels us forward over the next 10 years. We've increased the number of staff in the front line from around 70 to around 150, over 115 over the last 10-year period, and that's come at a considerable cost to ratepayers. I think that with the advancement of technology, there is clearly an understanding from the residents and the clients that this council serves that we will continue to move with the times and not get stuck in one particular channel of being able to deliver services. And I think that this strategy helps doing that. It comes potentially at an incredible cost, but that's a cost that is ultimately found through savings and the delivery of better outcomes for our residents. So I'm pleased that the new Director of Organisational Services and the new CEO are on board in this regards, and I look forward to discussing it again at Council on Friday. So, councillors, I'm going to take a division. All in favour?
Councillor Hamill, Councillor Gates, Councillor Patterson, Councillor Bartolomson, Councillor Taylor, Councillor Pauline Young and Councillor Owen Jones.
Thank you. Councillors, is there anything... Is there against? Sorry.
Councillor McDonald.
Is there any general business that anybody would like to raise? at 10:57, the meeting came to a close. Thank you, linesman. Thank you, board.